Eric's going to talk, and then we're going to have Q&A at the end. And do I need to introduce you, or do you have an introductory story?
You can do it.
I can do it? Okay. So there's a bio in your book that I'm just going to summarize in the program. So John Calhoun was born in Oklahoma City, and he moved to Oregon with his family. And when he was 5 years old, he moved to, or was committed to Fairview, which is, or was, one of Oregon's 2 institutions for people with disabilities, and both of them are closed. So when John tells a beautiful story about how he is a strong advocate for people with disabilities, and about how he is a good listener and a supporter. And he also, as is in his bio, it's his mission to educate as many people as possible about the capabilities of people with disabilities who are often and frequently underestimated. John, in 1993, received the Arthur Rubloff Memorial Award from the National United Cerebral Palsy Association for overcoming the physical problems of his disability and becoming a role model for individuals with and without disabilities, and this is true. John has some amazing stories that he's going to share with us today. And then Eric Matthes, to my right, is works at the ARC of King County as their self-advocacy coordinator, program coordinator. When he was born in the 1970s, doctors told his parents that they should put him in an institution, but they didn't. And Eric now works full-time and is a strong advocate in his community. He's also a role model for people with disabilities. He does a lot of legislative advocacy in Washington and also community advocacy. He's very involved in self-advocacy.
And I will add one more thing, which is not in that book,
Please
is
do.
that I see myself more as an activist advocate for all people with disability and without and being equal. Leading that parade, kind of like what Martin Luther King Jr. did, with what he believed in. Similarity of what I may believe in. He's one of my heroes in life, but not like my best friend or anything, but just someone that made history.
All right, thank you, Eric. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the mic over to John.
I was 49 years old when I moved to Portland, and another new chapter in my life, the United Cerebral Palsy, UCP Group Home. Roy and some other friends had already moved when I made the trip north. I missed Florence and my friends. There were many more rules at Alder Street. The administrator was nervous for me to ride the bus and restricted where I could go in the community. At first he wouldn't listen to me, but after 1 month let me go out more. From my first day at the UCP workshop, I liked the staff, but the work was boring. I worked in the work activity center. Some people could work faster, so they were in the sheltered workshop. At that time, no one talked to those of us in the Work Activities Center about working in the community or about supported employment. Occasionally, we would go on field trips to the zoo or to downtown Portland. After living at Alder Street for 5 years, I began to think about moving out on my own. In 1987, I started looking around and talking to people, including the administrator at Alder Street. She also began exploring options and found that there were tenant support and attendant programs, but then I didn't meet the requirements. A few of us at Alder Street really wanted to move, so I pushed UCP. At that time there were politics that I will not talk about, but as a result, the national UCP sent out Alan Bergman from Washington, D.C. and Jay Klein from Colorado to help us. Jay became our hero as he helped that they needed to develop a new service called supported living. A plan was developed for the group home to be sold and for all of us to be living in homes of our choice. Many of the residents and staff were scared and anxious about the changes. I, however, was confident that I could live on my own and never doubted that. The therapists were especially concerned about my ability to transfer. They recommended that I have a 3-person transfer, but I showed them that I could do it independently with minimal assistance with the right setup. I surprised everyone. I wanted to live alone in a high-rise apartment downtown. Given the state regulations, this seemed an impossible idea to the staff. However, with creative thinking by my friend Joe Wykowski, we found the perfect apartment on West Burnside. I would live on the first floor, but since the apartment building had 8 floors, I could use the 7th floor common area for parties. It had a great view that satisfied my need to live in a high-rise. I moved into my apartment on May 9, 1989. It was the first time in my entire life that I had slept in the quiet of my own home without anyone around. The condition of the national UCP for having Jay Klein work with our local UCP was that we would share our experiences with supported living. I was asked to speak and tell my story at the national convention. Bud Toon, Tara Say, and I were the keynote speakers for the San Diego convention in 1990. We spent many hours preparing a slideshow with my touch talker for my presentation. In addition to this being my first major speaking engagement, it was also my first ride on an airplane. The day of the flight, we arrived at the airport and stumbled into many challenges. Although we checked with the airlines ahead of time about bringing my power wheelchair and had followed their directions, the desk clerk would not allow us to bring my power chair on board. As my touch talker was attached to my chair, I needed it for my speech, so we took the chair without the battery. When we arrived in San Diego, we rented a manual chair as this was easier to maneuver than my big wheelchair. My job as case management assistant was to talk to groups about living on my own. I worked 5 days a week from 9 until 2. Initially, my job coach helped me with setting up my office and making arrangements for my speaking. Eventually, this was done by my co-workers and I no longer had the support of a provider agency at work. One of my duties was as a participant of the Supported Living Network and I represented the county at their meetings. I also did public speaking for providers, families, schools, and other organizations. Sometimes I would go to these meetings alone and other times another county staff would attend with me. One time I was a guest speaker for a group interested in sustainability. I was the only attendee with a disability and facilitated a group. We checked into our rooms and met downstairs in the lobby. As we were talking, we heard something odd. I was giving my speech although I didn't have my touch talker with me. It was an odd sensation for us to hear me speaking and yet here I was. We followed my voice to the storage room behind the concierge's desk. Our puzzled looks prompted the valet to confess that he had accidentally bumped into my touch talker and it had started speaking. He was fascinated by my speech and so had been listening to it in the storage room. We had a good laugh and he became our good friend for the entire stay. Our presentation went very well, and I got a standing ovation. Later we celebrated with dinner and drinks. I had my first soak in an outdoor hot tub under the stars with old and new friends. We broke the hotel rules and stayed past the 11 o'clock curfew time enjoying the stars conversing with whoever joined us in the tub. Later that week, we planned a nice dinner on the bay. We called ahead to be sure that the restaurant was accessible, but when we arrived, the front door was up a flight of stairs. Tara went to check and they told us to go around the back as there was an elevator we could use. We found the elevator and got in. When the door opened, we were in the middle of the kitchen of this very fancy restaurant. Although others were appalled, I just laughed at just another challenge. We had a tour of the kitchen and were seated in the dining room at a bay view window. Although the dinner was delicious and the conversation was good, the evening ended with us winding back through the kitchen to the elevator, which put a small damper on what was otherwise a memorable night. Later that week, we planned a nice dinner on the bay. We called ahead to be sure that the restaurant was accessible, but when we arrived, the front door was up a flight of stairs. Tara went to check and they told us to go around the back as there was an elevator we could use. We found the elevator and got in. When the door opened, we were in the middle of the kitchen of this very fancy restaurant. Although others were appalled, I just laughed at just another challenge. We had a tour of the kitchen and were seated in the dining room at a bay view window. Although the dinner was delicious and the conversation was good, the evening ended with us winding back through the kitchen to the elevator, which put a small damper on what was otherwise a memorable night. In 1993, I was granted the National UCP Arthur Rubloff Memorial Award, which is given to an upstanding citizen with disabilities who serves as a role model. This was a very big honor, and I was asked to accept the award in Washington, D.C. with all my expenses paid. We had a small delegation of board members and staff. This was a dream come true to be in the nation's capital and see all the historic sites. I walked to the White House, but didn't have the opportunity to meet the president. We did meet several of our Oregon congressional delegation. I have many pictures and memories of that special trip.
Book? You want your communication book? Push. John's pointing to the symbol in his book for push. It's the Sisyphean character laboring against a huge stone. And John uses this, along with the gesture here, to mean that he's been a self-advocate since he was a little boy, and anybody even ever thought of the term. Oh, okay.
It'll help my arm.
All right. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. Okay. Well, that's what you said a minute ago, so 24. Okay. What else, John? as introduction to this quick little story, I'll drop the mic and then say it's really been a theme in John's talks the last year, how much he lives to help other people. And that's where this story comes from. It's titled, "A Boy I Helped at Fairview." While I was at Fairview, living at Bird Cottage, a family brought their young son to stay there for a while. He had cerebral palsy and needed an operation on his legs to help him to walk. One of the staff members yelled at him one day and frightened him very badly. The boy started yelling and screaming at night so that nobody could sleep. I decided to go outside with him one day so that nobody else was around, and I talked with him about what was scaring him and why he was yelling and screaming at night. We did this every day for about 3 weeks, and all during that time he gradually felt better and less scared. He stopped yelling and screaming at night, and he and all the rest of us were able to get enough sleep. It made me feel good to be able to help him this way, and it certainly seemed to make him feel better too. After the boy recovered from his operation, his mother and father came to Fairview and took him home with them. When he grew up, he became a policeman. He would never have been able to be a policeman if his mother and father had not sought out the help for the surgery he needed, and if I had not helped him to calm his fears while he was at Fairview. Two more minutes. You want to take any questions they might have? I don't know. Does anybody want to ask a question? Yes.
I would. How did you accomplish your goal and moving on your own when you moved from Oklahoma to Oregon?
A woman? A woman who helped you? Yeah. There was a lot of people who helped you. Is there a woman in particular you're thinking of? No. They were mostly women? Okay. So I guess with a lot of help. Being a self-advocate is great, but that doesn't mean you don't need help. Any other questions? No? Okay. Go ahead, let him have it. What do you want to say? Oh, the other way? In the back? Oh, I'm sorry. Psychology. The way John's explained his interest in psychology to me is as a much younger person in an institution where he'd been misdiagnosed as mentally retarded, he had to find a way to get into the heads of the people that he needed to convince to do what he wanted to have done. And in a way, it kind of continues today, because you kind of get into the heads of all your staff to find, not in any mean way, but in a way to find out how this person can receive the information most effectively. And believe me, after 5 years with John, I've seen him cover a spectrum of approaches to training staff and to get staff to understand that this week, how I want to accomplish this is different